So here's the agenda for today's session. So first of all, we're going to go over why are we doing the CES? Why do these licensing changes matter to you all? Next, we'll talk about just a generic licensing overview for Solid Edge. For any of you that may be on an older version of Solid Edge, you haven't really been keeping up to date with the latest changes. So I'll talk a little bit about that. Thirdly, we'll go over these recent changes that Siemens have been putting through the system that of course affect all of you. And of course, fourthly, we'll go over the options for all of you moving forward. And as Andy said, we'll wrap up with a live Q&A session. So why do these licensing changes matter? Well, it affects a lot of you. So many of you are using or have been using the cloud-enabled licensing for the past few years. I believe it came out in Solid Edge 2021 or so. So several years ago, Siemens enabled this cloud-enabled licensing technology. So what that meant was for anybody that had a node-locked Solid Edge license, you could toggle a little switch and it would allow you to basically sign in to the cloud, and that's how you would pull your license. So you could have Solid Edge installed on any number of machines, and instead of having a local node lock license file, you basically sign in, and that's how you access your Solid Edge license file. So very similar to how you sign in from any machine to your Office 365 account, for example, or any other subscription that's online nowadays, which we are seeing a lot of course. And we don't actually have the real numbers. I just put kind of a rough guess, but from what I've seen personally over the years, I'm guessing at least or roughly around a quarter or 25% of you all are using this cloud or have been using this cloud enabled licensing. So a good amount of customers out there. The second major change that has happened is to the home and travel licenses. So I'm sure a lot of you have already noticed that, and that's of course a big change because it's basically just been gotten rid of completely. So you of course need to explore other options, which is why we're putting on the CES session. And this actually affects not just node locked users, but floating licenses as well. So let's move into the overview of Solid Edge licensing. So there's 5 sections that I kind of broke this up into. So first we'll talk about the types of Solid Edge licensing, node locked and floating, and the new named user cloud licensing that some of you may have already heard of with Solid Edge X, which is a brand new product that just came out a few months ago with the release of Solid Edge 2025. Second, we'll evaluate a license file. So for those of you that do have traditional node lock license files or floating license files, we'll take a look at what those look like nowadays and any recent changes that have been going on that you may or may not be familiar with already. Next, we'll talk about the Siemens license server and how that works, because it is quite a bit different than how it was in the past with the PLM license servers, as it was called before, the earlier license installers. Next, we'll talk about the license options file, which a lot of you may not even be aware of. So I'm going to briefly mention that. And finally, license borrowing. So again, something that some of you may not even be aware of. That's something that can be very useful, especially with all these changes happening. So let's jump into the types of Solid Edge licenses available to everyone. So first is node locked. As it sounds, node lock licenses are basically locked to, and let me get my cursor here. Node lock licenses are tied to a specific machine. And this is a Solid Edge generated number that is called the composite 2 number. And that is not to be confused with the traditional composite host ID or CID. This is the composite 2 or CID 2 number. So a very important distinction there for any of you that are familiar with the composite if you have floating licenses. And how you access or retrieve that number is right in the Solid Edge license utility. So anybody who's been using Solid Edge is probably familiar with that license utility, and it actually shows that composite 2 number right there. So that's how you can retrieve that number and assign your licenses to your machines. Next, let's talk about floating licenses. So with floating licenses, you have to set up what's called a license server, and that can be either a desktop or an actual server machine. It can be a laptop. It can be any machine. There's no real restrictions on that, beyond basic minimum system requirements, of course, for operating system and whatnot. Standard Windows. So that gets set up with LM Tools is most people are familiar with Elm Tools. That's kind of the software program that runs in the background and it creates a service, a Windows service basically that manages the licenses. So in a nutshell, you have this license server again that's managing your 1, 2, 3, 5, 10, 100 floating license files for or seats, or we'll call them, uh, however many number of seats of Solid Edge, and then you have any number of clients that simply talk to that server, that license server, to pull the licenses out when they're opening Solid Edge, and as soon as you close Solid Edge, it just checks that license right back into the server so that somebody else can check it out. And the number of clients, again, does not need to match the number of licenses you have. And this is a very common scenario, actually. So if you have, for example, 10 users that sporadically need to use Solid Edge, maybe not all day, every day, but, they use it a couple hours here, a couple hours there. That's a very good use case for floating licenses. So even though you may have 10 sporadic users, it may be the most cost effective to have only 4 or 5 actual floating licenses. So those 10 users can share 5 licenses, if that makes sense. So that's basically what the license server is doing. It's managing those licenses, it's checking them in and out as clients are opening and closing Solid Edge. All right, so that's basically in a nutshell how the floating license scenario works. And finally, we have the new named user cloud licensing. And again, this is brand new. It just came out in October with Solid Edge 2025 with a new product called Solid Edge X. And we actually have another CES session on our YouTube channel if you want to dig for that, to get the finer details. I believe it's part 2 of the What's New in Solid Edge 2025 from a few months ago. Our Greg Chastain put that one on. So that one has, a lot more detail, and I have a slide here later that'll show you the website as well. But basically, that is a kind of a new method for licensing. And this is, again, not to be confused with the traditional cloud-based licensing that I was just talking about a few minutes ago. That's been around since Solid Edge 2021 or so, for a few years. So this is a completely new technology that again is based on the cloud. So it roughly works very similar to the existing cloud-based licensing, but it's basically a more modern, newer, up-to-date, more secure cloud licensing technology. Now down here at the bottom of the slide, I do have a note that I wanted to mention in case any of you are not aware. So floating licenses do offer a very beneficial method of accessing add-on or portfolio products, which is called value-based, aka token licensing. And you can see a list here that actually grew with the last, that's been growing with the last couple of releases of 2024 and 2025. So it's been around for a couple of years already, but you can see a list there of all the add-on portfolio products that are available with this new token licensing. So you can see express route for piping and tubing, electrical routing for modeling your cables and wires and harnesses and things like that. Both the simulation standard and advanced, the generative design pro, the advanced PMI add-on, the point cloud visualization add-on, PCB collaboration, the CATIA V4 and V5 translators, the piping design add-on, PNID, and finally the machinery library and the piping library, which both of those are for the standard parts. For those of you that are familiar with standard parts for nuts, bolts, washers, hardware, fasteners, things like that. So you can see, and again, that list has grown. So they've done a great job adding a few more of these add-ons to the token licensing. And again, there's, if you have any questions on this, please reach out to us. We can help. There's, we have material on our website, on Saratech. Siemens, of course, has a page on value-based licensing. But a quick overview of what that is it's basically similar to traditional floating licenses. It's very helpful for sporadic usage. So if you have somebody that's using simulation all day, every day, then in that case, it's probably more cost effective to actually purchase that add-on outright, like you normally have, for many years. But if you have many users that are, using all these different add-on products here and there, maybe one day they're doing a express route for a couple hours, then a couple weeks later they might be doing a little bit of simulation and so on. So for sporadic usage, that is the perfect scenario for where this token-based licensing makes sense, because it's much cheaper than purchasing all of those add-ons outright, right? Because if they're not being used full time, then these tokens are much more cost effective. So next, let's jump into what the actual license files look like. So on the left, we have a node-lock license file, and on the right, we have a floating license file. And just kind of a note at the top here, I just mentioned that the editable lines, or I don't want to say phrase, but the editable sections or snippets are in green, but you can see there are not many. And the important lines just that I want to mention here are highlighted in red. So let's talk about node lock licenses first. If you see a date here, you should all be seeing my cursor. So right here, you can see July 31st, 2024. So this is a temporary license, or maybe it's, those features are just expiring, whether it's temporary or whether it's a subscription license or a trial, whatever the case is, that feature of that license file will be expiring on that date. All right, so if you have in the past, used permanent or perpetual licensing, then you may be familiar with seeing the word permanent there instead of a date. Nowadays, for the last few years, obviously, I'm sure you're all well aware of, with Siemens, like most other companies did several years ago, have been moving to the yearly subscription model. So nowadays, more and more customers are going to be seeing dates in here. But again, that date is very important. That is when those features will be expiring. The next important little snippet here that I wanted to highlight is this host ID composite equals. And again, we're talking about node lock licenses here, which is where you're the only place where you're going to see this. You won't see this in floating. So this composite is that composite 2 number that I mentioned. So in the Solid Edge license utility, that composite 2 number, that's basically where this gets set. So this Solid Edge Classic seat is assigned to this composite number called user2 laptop, right? So that's just the host name of that machine, which doesn't really matter. The only thing that matters is that composite 2 number here. Okay, and then let's move over to the right side. So floating licenses. So very important for floating licenses is the composite number. And again, this is the regular, well, I don't want to say 1 because it doesn't show 1, but the traditional composite number, not to be confused with the composite 2 number that node lock licenses use. So with floating licenses, you'll run what's called the getcid.exe. So it's a small little executable that you run, and it opens up basically a DOS or command prompt, and it shows you your machine information. So it'll give you that composite number as well as your host name. And once you have that license file, registered to your composite of your license server machine, you have the host name as well. So this is editable actually. So it should be saved in the Siemens system, but just in case, if it wasn't updated last time accidentally, you can actually change you can update that host name manually if needed. All right, and then next you also have the port. And right now that's showing 28,000. And one important thing I want to mention is with the recent Siemens license server installers, which I'm going to talk about shortly actually, that actually makes some changes to the license file. So you can see traditionally for many years, for Solid Edge floating licenses, the vendor daemon has been this UGS LMD. So it's basically kind of the executable that runs in the background that manages the floating license. Nowadays, with the new Siemens license server installers, it actually changes that automatically in the background to what's called the SALT D. So SALT stands for Siemens Advanced Licensing Technology. So that is the new vendor daemon. And that's why, as I'm going to explain shortly, it's very important nowadays to run through that Siemens license server installer, and that automates all of this for you. So a lot of you that have in the past manually, used LM tools and, moved the license file and updated the host name and ports and all of that, we don't really have to do any of that anymore. The SLS installer nowadays sets everything up for us automatically. So on that note, this is what I was just talking about. So the Siemens license server, we just call it SLS for short. Currently, the latest version is 4.3.0, as you can see here on the Siemens support website. So you can see Support Center, Siemens license server is a product. And once you go to downloads, you'll see the Siemens license server executable right here. And again, that is anytime you need to update your license file. So not just for the initial installation, but anytime you need to update your license file, you need to run through this installer. again, it makes some changes automatically in the background to the license file, and basically sets it up for you, so you don't really have to do anything else, honestly. So once you run the installer, this is what it looks like. You can see if it recognizes an earlier version. You can see here, for example, my machine, I only have the version 4.2.0, so it's recognizing that it's going to upgrade to 4.3. And at the same time, you can choose to add, or in this case, or most cases, replace a license file. So if you're upgrading from Solid Edge 2024 to 2025, for example, you would simply choose that first checkbox, browse to your new 2025 license file, and the installer changes those daemons and ports for you automatically, and it's up and running after that. So it's a lot simpler nowadays. And of course, we're always here in case you ever run into any issues. One additional thing I wanted to mention here is the options file that a lot of you may not be aware of for floating licenses. So in the Flexera License Administration Guide, there is actually a full chapter, as you can see here. I think it's chapter 8 or 9 or so. That's called Managing the Options File. And here you can see in the background some paths that it comes with the, basically that PDF guide comes with the installation directory. And I'm not going to go through all the fine details here, but the use case of this is if you have different levels of Solid Edge licenses. So if you have, for example, some foundation seats, some classic seats, some premium seats, I'm sure you're all well aware that those premium seats, the highest level, those get checked out first. So whoever, early bird gets the worm, right? So whoever opens up Solid Edge in the morning first, those premium seats get taken first, then the classic seats, finally the foundation seats. So this options file actually lets you control that. So as I have shown here in this little snippet, this little notepad, I have a simple line that says, okay, I want to reserve one seat of Solid Edge Premium for a user named John Smith. So that's really how simple it is. There's, all the syntax is explained in the guide. But again, as always, if you need any help with this, please reach out to us. And by the way, how you set that up is you just create that simple line, or you can have a few different lines, and uh, there's different keywords, and you can reserve, you can exclude people, you can include people. There's a few different options that this guy talks about. But all you do is create a simple text file. You call it ugslmd.opt, or nowadays it would be the saltd.opt. And as long as that's right in that same directory of the licensing, it's going to pick up on that automatically. Okay, next important thing I wanted to mention, in case any of you are not aware, with floating licenses, you have the ability to do what's called license borrowing. So in your start menu, you can go to the Solid Edge, Siemens Solid Edge 2025, or whichever version you're running, group of commands, and you'll see this license borrow utility. If you open that, you'll see this window, and all you need to do is click on borrowing settings, then click on this borrow button up here. You'll get this little window that pops up with all of your available licenses. So you just check, turn on the checkbox for premium or classic or whichever add-ons you might need. Then you pick the date. It's actually I think up to 120 days, roughly, like 3 or 4 months, something like that. That's the maximum time that you can actually borrow a license. And you press OK in this window. And finally, very important, you need to click Apply in the licensing tool window here. You can see number 6. So what that does, just kind of FYI, it basically creates a temporary local license file in your registry on your machine. So at that point, you can disconnect from the server. You do not need an internet connection. At that point, you've basically checked out that license for however long you set here in the window from that license pool. So now instead of having 5 seats on the floating license server, you have checked one out. So now there's only 4 available for everybody else to use because you've checked one out to your local machine. Let's say you're hitting the road or something. That's a very good use case for this. Okay, so next let's jump into the recent licensing changes, so which there are 2 basically. So first is the removal of the home license option and the travel license option. And those I know were very popular. I'm sure many of you have used that because it was available to both node lock and floating license users. And this happened a few months ago in October with the release of Solid Edge 2025. You no longer have the option to generate home license files or travel license files. All right, and the second major change is the discontinuation of the original cloud-based licensing that I talked about earlier. So that's the one that came out a few years ago with Solid Edge 2020 or 2021 or so. And for version 2023, if that's what you were running, that was scheduled to end just a few days ago, actually, on March 31st. And if you were running Solid Edge 2024 or 2025, that was scheduled to end at the beginning of next year, January 1st, 2026. Now, and just kind of FYI, the reason that Siemens has been going through this is, as I mentioned earlier, security, right? So the traditional cloud-based licensing that's been available for a few years, it was kind of an older technology. So due to Microsoft and other security reasons, they've been transitioning to this newer cloud-based licensing technologies. Now, I do want to mention, one of the big reasons why we're putting on the CES session today is because they've actually been seeing, a lot more issues with this cloud-based licensing than they anticipated. So for some users, it might actually still be working, but we have been getting a lot of tickets with users that it's the cloud-based licensing is just not working anymore. And unfortunately, there's again due to just the security situation and Microsoft and whatnot, uh, it's we can basically call it terminated. If it's not working for you, it doesn't seem like it's going to be fixed before that it was scheduled to be terminated on January 1st anyway. So that's again why we're putting on this CES session, so we can talk about options for all of you moving forward. So first, if you have no luck license and you were using the traditional cloud-based licensing, then you can of course go back to the traditional local license file, right? That's tied to your composite 2 number that I talked about earlier. Second, you can use a VPN or remote desktop if you have floating licenses. So with a VPN, you're basically porting into your the network at the office. So it's almost like you were sitting there in the office. At that point, you could of course pull your floating licenses from the license server just as if you were in the office. But since you're on VPN, you could of course be on the road somewhere. Similarly, you can use remote desktop. Now, again, that obviously depends on your internet speed and computer resources, if that's going to be really good enough to use a remote desktop session to actually use Solid Edge remotely versus just using a VPN just to pull the license remotely. The third option is if you are using a node-lock license and you were using the cloud-based licensing, you can actually upgrade to floating, which I believe is just a small charge actually just to upgrade to floating. And that would give you access to license borrowing that I just mentioned a few slides ago. So that again lets you check out a license to your local machine from the pool of licenses on the server. And again, that lets you hit the road, if you will. And finally, you can upgrade to Solid Edge X. Again, that's a new cloud-based, hybrid SaaS product. And you can see a snippet here of the website. If you just Google Solid Edge X, it should take you straight. The first result is the Siemens Solid Edge X website. You can see here tons of great information. At the bottom, there's actually a chart showing you the different levels, and I think even the pricing is there. You can see you can compare lots of great information. There's even an FAQ with many good, Q&A bullet points there that you can read through. And of course, we're always here to help with any questions or any help that you may need. And again, that Solid Edge X does use that new named user cloud-based licensing. So basically, you have an online portal where let's say you have 5 users of Solid Edge X, you would assign each of those 5 seats to each of your 5 users, and they would again log in basically instead of having to manage with a floating the floating license service and setting all that up on the server. All your users are simply using the cloud basically to access their licenses from any machine anywhere in the world. All right, so that about wraps it up. So in summary, if you've been using the cloud-enabled licensing or the home or travel licenses, you definitely need to do some planning, as I've talked to you about today. So again, reach out to us if you have any questions, concerns, or if you need any support through any of this. And with that, I'll hand it back over to Andy to wrap it up.
All right, thanks, Dan. So before we move on to the Q&A, and while we're waiting for a couple questions to come in, just a reminder, we do provide full training for Solid Edge and support, like Daniel had mentioned before. If you have any issues or questions, please reach out to us through our website or email support@saratech.com. Um, if you have questions, now is the time to enter them into the Q&A or the chat box. While we're waiting, I did have a couple of questions that came in. Dan, you can move on to the next slide. So, question came in about cost. What does Solid Edge X cost?
Good question. So if you are using, traditional floating licenses like Classic or Premium, if you are interested in upgrading to the Solid Edge X product, I believe there is a slight increase because the Solid Edge product does come with some great benefits, right? There's built-in data management, for example. If any of you use Team Center or are interested in using Team Center for your product lifecycle management, for revision, check in, check out, workflows, things like that. It actually comes with all of that support built in for embedded client and things like that. There are definitely some advantages that come with Solid Edge X in addition to this new named user cloud-based licensing, which are global, by the way. So traditionally, if you needed to use licenses, outside of the United States, there's always been an upcharge, of course, to be able to convert those licenses to global, but these new Solid Edge X licenses are global by default. So there's a slight cost increase, but I'm sure you'll find it well worth it for many use cases.
All
And again,
right.
I believe the website does have some rough numbers, but of course, if you reach out to us, we can get your solutions consultant involved and give you some actual numbers.
All right, another kind of follow-up question are so in your environment or in the customer's environment, there could be a mixture of different types of licenses, right? So Solid Edge X, maybe floating licenses, maybe some node log, or no, does it have to be all or nothing?
Yeah, I guess let me break that question up because as far as a single machine is concerned, so as far as what you can have installed, it is one or the other. So you can't, for example, run traditional Solid Edge and Solid Edge X on the same machine at the same time. So that's, part one of that question, I'll say. As far as what you can actually purchase. Maybe you have different departments. That I believe we can confirm. Please reach out to us. So we can look into your exact, your specific account and just confirm. But depending on if you have, different departments, different teams that may be using traditional Solid Edge locally, and then you have some other users that may want to use Solid Edge X, that should definitely still be possible. So yeah, please reach out to us and we can do a little bit more digging on that for you.
All right, thanks, Dan. That's all the questions that we have.
Thanks everyone. Take care.